So welcome to a new debate in the series, The Activist Museum, going deeper. Our deepest thanks to Margaret and to Ben for accepting our invitation to be with us today. I got to know about Ben and his museum through Margaret, and I can't forget what Ben said when I wrote. He said, "Whatever Margaret suggests, I do." So I said, that's a great sign. This will be a great debate. So thank you so much for being with us. As I told Margaret, I read her chapter in Adina Langer's book, Storytelling in Museums, last summer. And Margaret's chapter was called Queer Narratives and the Family Audiences. And I absolutely loved it. It made me laugh. It made me laugh because it was that feeling of, I've heard all the arguments. Let's look at them one by one and, get over with them. So what kind of arguments were those? First of all, I like the fact that Margaret questioned what a family is, what we mean when we say family audiences. And then concerns such as we need to protect the children. These are not appropriate issues for children. We're confusing the children. So perhaps we could start with you, Margaret, and it would be nice to hear a bit more about these kind of concerns and how museums can answer these concerns and also deal with them. Thank you.
Thank you. So those arguments that I talk about in the chapter against against queer topics in museums that use children and families as a very convenient cover for censorship, basically. What I do in the chapter is I trace a short, not a comprehensive history, but a short history of how political movements have weaponized that term child or family friendly. And we use those terms in museums all the time. We do mean different things, but we're trading in the same language. And so what I wanted to do was to point out that we have to be really, really explicit about what we mean when we say family friendly, thinking about like, what do we really mean by age appropriate or family even? So, in that very short political history of the way that, and I specifically am looking at the way that those terms have been weaponized in the US and the UK. So I would be really interested in hearing from folks who have different experiences, how they see commonalities or differences in the way that in the way that those get used elsewhere. But that's my experience as an American and then living in the UK. Yeah, it's really just about like thinking like, let's be really clear about who we mean when we say family, and to acknowledge the fact that there are a lot of assumptions that we're making about the experiences of children, very specifically in this particular case, that they have no queer identities themselves or queer people in their lives.
Yes, Ben, would you like to add to this?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I agree with everything that Margaret is bringing forward. A year ago in the States, Gallup, which is the sort of largest polling organization, did a poll, and the results showed that 21% of adults under 25 now identify as queer or as part of the LGBTQ plus community. So that's 20% of adults between the age of 18 and 25. So I think it just sort of reinforces what Margaret's saying, which is that children, young people who are not yet adults, have an ease and a comfort and a perspective on queer identity that is very far ahead of where many adults over the age of 25 and are. And so I think this just really goes back to the ways in which educational institutions and museums fall into the habit of talking down or assuming less of audiences than they need to be. And so I think, what Margaret's asking in the field in that article in Queer Possibilities is just so important, because it's just getting at the ways in which heteronormative standards, patriarchy, misogyny, white supremacy have informed our approaches in ways that may feel invisible at this point because they're so structural, but are so easily exposed as bias, when you take a look at them.
Yeah. One of the things I kept thinking as I was reading Margaret's chapter was that many of us now, our children are in school. Some children have two mothers, two fathers. It's not something people hide, it's there. And still, in museums and in other contexts, when we say family, what comes in mind is a specific version of a family, and we don't move on from that. And also something else Margaret brought up, as I was reading some biographies, many queer people, they share that they had this feeling of queerness since they were very, very young. Some of them, they were 4 years old. And also this is something that is not part of our collective consciousness. So when we say that these are not appropriate matters, or we're confusing the two, probably we're confusing them even more. Another thing that Margaret brought up in that article was that these stories should be part of the mainstream. Should be part of the mainstream narratives in museums that tend to be treated as if they're special, or they're part of temporary exhibitions or special events. So this is a question for both of you. I think I didn't mention in the beginning that Ben is the executive director of the American LGBTQ Museum. So don't you think that both things are needed? Or when we try to say that these stories are part of everyone's story, of our society's story, what is the need for an LGBTQ plus museum?
Yeah, I do think what you're sort of pointing to is the ways we are in a shift around the idea of identity-specific museums, as we really consider contexts of intersectionality as younger generations are sort of moving forward with a much greater comfort around concepts of fluidity in so many different aspects of life. Identity-specific museums have to be very clear about sort of why they're coming into existence at this point, because people are holding so many concurrent pieces of identity. The need for an LGBTQ plus museum in the States, queer history, as you indicated, is American history. American history is queer history. And the fact is that there is a shockingly low number of exhibitions, programs, interpretive sort of interventions, experiences created by history organizations that center the lives of queer people. And so as we think about this museum, we sort of think about it as three pieces. We're going to have a physical location in New York, our headquarters, our home base in New York City. And in some ways, sort of more important than that place, which will be a wonderful place, will be a core exhibit, a place to visit, a place where LGBTQ people can come and really feel like they've entered a space that is devoted to aspects of their lives and their experiences and their ancestors in ways that they don't see anywhere else. So that's hugely important for the people who can get there. And there will be plenty of people who can get there because of the population in New York and because New York is such a center for tourism. But in some ways, more importantly, are sort of the second and third strategies for the organization. One, to create a set of traveling exhibitions that will travel to history organizations around the country so that families in smaller population areas, families in states where legislation is being passed that really curtails their lives and their liberties, can go to their local history organizations and see LGBTQ history presented with sort of a national perspective and a local focus. And so, you know, we're going to have about 4,000 square feet, which is about, I think, 400 square meters in New York. It'll be a reasonable but modest sized place. We expect to have, you know, 4 or 5 times that amount of square feet in the form of traveling exhibitions that show up in museums around the country. And then, of course, the third piece is the digital or online museum, which I think, you know, in most instances as an experience, I think it's safe to say is a pretty poor one. I mean, please let me know when you go to a museum, sort of a digital museum or a digital exhibition that's really compelling. But it doesn't mean that that space needs to not be compelling. And so really thinking about experiences that are born digital, that work best online, is going to be the third piece of that. And that, of course, is about reaching people around the world and across the country who won't get to a physical location. There's no question in our mind that the resurgence of attacks centered very much in this area, centered as sort of parental rights or protections for children that have just exploded over the last year in the US and in other parts of the world, are very much linked to the fact that we don't grow up learning about the histories of LGBTQ people. Our histories and our lives are not normalized within formal or informal educational contexts. You don't go to the Natural History Museum and learn about the absolute sort of sorry, I'm sick. You don't learn about the fact that there are many species, hundreds and thousands of species that have that are gender fluid, that engage in sort of same gender sexual relations. You know, you don't learn about this when you go to the zoo. I mean, there are tons of places, not just museums, where this could be normalized, where the fact of gender fluidity and the large landscape connected to sexual orientation, you know, could be normalized. And so that's why we still do need LGBTQ plus museums that are specific to our experiences, in part as a place of safety for community, but in part as a site for creating the products that are missing from other museums and cultural organizations.
Yes, thank you, Ben. Margaret, would you like to add to this? On the one hand, just to remind the question, on the one hand, we need these stories to be a natural part of our narratives as a society. On the other hand, the need for identity-specific museums.
Yeah, well, something that I'm so excited about the American LGBTQ Museum, like coming into existence, is that it's going to become this precedent, you know, an example, you know, you're leading by example, and I think other institutions will kind of look to you as a way to like, oh, guess we could, you know, like they may learn about people or movements or communities in the past that actually have connections to their site, or their state, and they'll be able to, get inspired. To me, I think that's kind of one of the biggest things that we need, or that it can be so influential when doing new stuff in museums, is really looking around for those case studies and inspiration. It's so much easier to make a case when you're working, especially if you're working in a small museum or a large one that maybe feels like they have more to lose. That there's like so much fear. There's so much fear around interpreting queer topics in museums. That fear is rooted in homophobia. Like, I want to be really clear about that. It feels risky. Well, it feels risky because it is, like, we're as Ben was saying, like, we're watching as drag artists are being attacked and doxxed, and we're seeing like all of these, and these are people who are like interfacing with cultural institutions. Their work is, in many cases, when museums are working with queer artists, it can sometimes be like a co-optation, and they're not being protected. And so anyway, just to say that, like, there's so much vulnerability there, I guess. So the risk is real, but it's due to homophobia.
Do you think we are aware as museum professionals working in different contexts of what we mean when we say protection? What we mean when we say we need to create safe spaces for colleagues, for artists? Do you think we're aware of it? What does this mean?
Well, this is something that I'm thinking a lot about right now, because we had, just here in Belfast, there was a drag artist who was working with a museum here last year, who was like, there was a protest, and there was, this person was stalked, and like really bad stuff happened, and the museum really did nothing. So I think when I'm talking about co-optation, I'm really talking about the idea that, like, museums and cultural institutions are very happy to benefit from queer artists, but are not necessarily going to be there when stuff goes down.
Yeah.
And I think that shouldn't detract, it shouldn't like make anybody feel like they don't want to do this work. But I think, like, just being realistic about it, like, I think something that I have noticed is that there is this like my colleagues, people, other museum professionals will tell me, like, that they are so shocked by homophobia and transphobia. And I think what they're trying to tell me is that they themselves don't hold those beliefs. But it's really important for all of us in the museum community to keep our eyes open, and to really like notice what's going on, and to understand those risks, and then protect the people we work with as a result. And I think, my guess is that these, like, an LGBTQ specific museum is going to have a lot more expertise, a lot more background knowledge, like all of the people that you work with, Ben. Like, I'm sure, like, you'll all just, like, you'll know that the risks involved, and you'll know what to do.
Ben?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about sort of that term, that sort of, Nina Simon, one of our colleagues, talks about museums as being space makers for risk takers. And that is about sort of creating spaces where people can safely take risks, and you will protect them, and you will have their back. And I think there are so many ways in which museums are not safe for queer people, or for Black and Brown people here in the States. And that is about the ways in which they have not done the work internally to look at sort of the structural homophobia and racism and sort of patriarchy and sort of colonized thinking that sort of infuses the structures and the policies and procedures of museums. And it's because oftentimes they're bringing queer artists in as something out of the ordinary, not something that is just sort of inherent to the work that they do. And so until both of those are, as museum professionals, the thing we need to do first is do the internal work, because the only ways that we're going to set our colleagues up to really help support the lives of queer artists or queer families is for them to know that this is an organization that truly supports them and supports the queer staff and the queer members of that internal community. And then it's only from that foundation that you can really go out and make as safe a space as possible. When you're talking about safe spaces in the US, we've got a situation here around gun violence and around guns that make that real in a very different way for those of us working in the United States in museums. And so, our colleagues who are opening the Stonewall National Monument Visitors Center are installing bulletproof glass and have a panic room so that staff can flee and be in a armored, protected space within that. And we are going to be working in the same kinds of ways because the threats here really have escalated to threats of gun violence and death. And that's what you're seeing at the Drag Queen story hours at libraries here. You're seeing people show up with assault weapons and sort of surrounding the library. And I just feel like that, hopefully is not the situation for y'all right now, but it's something we think about very, very viscerally.
Feels very barbaric, really. We are following the news, and libraries are particularly hit by all these barbaric attitudes. As I was listening to you, I thought of two things. Margaret, a little while ago, gave us the example of a museum that was collaborating with a queer artist, and when that artist was attacked, violated, the museum did nothing. I was thinking of another thing. I'm not sure. I don't know if you've heard about a recent law in Hungary, which is a European Union state, and all these things about European principles and values, etc. The new law says that a person can denounce an LGBT person anonymously. Me, not my first thought, but one of my first thoughts was, what are culture organizations going to do about it? This is culture. This is how we develop as human beings. This is who we are. What are we going to do about it? And at the same time, I thought of the example of Pinacoteca, an art museum in São Paulo. I think it was in 2017, after the election of Bolsonaro, that they hired trans people as guards. And we had a debate with them a couple of years ago to understand a bit better how this came about. And one of the things they shared with us was exactly what Ben said a little while ago. First, it was the internal work that needed to be done. It's not just about opening the door and saying, come in, because the team, the staff had to be prepared. They had to be better informed, more empathetic, more knowledgeable. And then they had to do the work because these people were actually attacked by visitors. So the team, the staff, everybody, the museum community had to be ready for that. And when I think that this happened in a political context, in the country where I think it has the highest rate of trans people's murders in the world, I think it is Brazil. And then, of course, all the rhetoric of Bolsonaro as a president, I think they were brave, but I think they did the right thing. That's what it is to be a museum, Maybe I'm sure because we have a lot of people with us today, maybe you could turn on your cameras if you feel like it. You can ask your questions, you can make your comments. So please join and feel free, turn your mics on, or if you prefer to write the question in the chat, even if it's not in English, we'll manage. Please feel free to join in whatever way makes you feel more comfortable. So any questions or comments for our guests? Not yet, you're still thinking. How can we, I'll ask one more just to give you some time to think. How can we encourage people in those activities developed by museums to get involved in these discussions, in these debates? I remember in Margaret's article, there was a part, it was museum activities for families where people would be encouraged to say, tell us about your family. What do we understand by family? What can we do so that people don't feel so threatened or comfortable in these spaces, museum space?
Well, I think that one of the there's a case study that I use in the chapter from a children's museum where I used to work. And so really just as a way to back up entirely, that's my background, is in children's museums. And so I really bring that lens to what I'm working on. And it happened that because that was the space I was working in, that was the audience that I was interested in engaging. But I think it turns out that it's actually kind of a really perfect way in a general audience type museum, focusing on children, because I think something that happens, there's a dynamic that happens when adults bring children to museums. Sometimes there's a desire to play teacher, or there's, it could be a special day out and there's an opportunity to you learn together and to make sure that they're getting the most out of their visit. So, a lot of adults like to express, their own experience or their own expertise in the museum. And if they have any nervousness at all around queer topics, then they don't want to go into a space where they can't answer any questions. And so because we developed that exhibit, Mimi's Family, in a way that explained everything at the level of like a six-year-old, grown-ups, they could read the labels on the wall to their children and they were learning themselves, but we set it up so it was like they could feel like they were, in control or they were able to feel like they had a role to play, and they could also learn themselves. And so I think that there's something really, really nice about that dynamic. It takes the pressure off of everybody. And that is actually probably the level that a lot of folks need that information at anyway.
Ben, how do you think you will deal with this through your traveling exhibitions that will go around the country?
Yeah, I think what Margaret's describing is the real power of that form, of the form that we get to play with exhibitions. We can show, not tell. There is a big, as I go around and talk to people about this museum, I am recognizing what I think a lot of people are recognizing, which is that there is an older generation of cisgendered lesbian and gay people who were absolute leaders in the movement in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And I really see, somewhere around, Gen X, and older, a lot of confusion and some level of hostility toward concepts of gender identity, fluidity, transgender identity. So much of it rooted in ignorance, and a really just a very different sort of level of understanding, acceptance, perspective, generationally. And so I think a lot about sort of the role of our museum is going to be to do exactly what Margaret described. Ask the question, answer the questions that people feel embarrassed to ask, feel like they don't know how to ask. Do that very basic sort of gender identity 101, LGBTQ identity 101 work in exhibitions. Not that that's the topic of the exhibition, but you do that when you're addressing another topic, right? So let's say we're doing something on the relationship of fashion and gender, right? It's a great exhibition about our relationship to clothing and the ways all of us through our lives use clothing to express facets of our identity, and sort of the ways in which the fashion industry sort of reinforces the binary or pushes against it. And so it's really a show about sort of something we all experience, which is a relationship with clothing. But through that, you can answer a lot of basic questions that people who haven't opened up, who don't have friends, family, who they've really explored the concepts of gender identity and expression with, will have a chance to sort of have some of those things answered. So yeah, I think we're gonna absolutely, hopefully work with Margaret and also like take a page from that book.
Yeah. So Ren are asking a question, and then I see that a couple of people are answering already. Ren says, I'm one of those 1825 queer individuals in the museum field. Thank you for having this conversation today. Do you have any advice for Gen Z queer museum professionals? What did you wish you knew before joining the field? What would you tell your younger self?
I can take a stab at that. So I am 37 and I was not out. Not at work. I wasn't out at work when I began in museums. And I was kind of told in not in so many words, I guess is the phrase, that it wasn't something that I should bring to work by another queer person who was much older than me at the museum. And I guess I don't really know what to do with that one, other than to say that like I think that like hopefully by being visible, I can hopefully like help other people feel like they can bring their whole selves if they want to work with them in the museum field. I think like more broadly, I think that I made an assumption that everyone from who, had any sort of LGBTQ identity at work was going to be on the same page as I was. And I guess like that maybe sounds really negative, and I really don't mean it that way, because I think that it comes from a real place and I respect it. And it helps me like just know. It helps me know that like everybody's coming at this from a different place, but like some of the biggest pushback that I received internally when I was working in-house in museums was from other LGBTQ people. So I think there needs to be like a little bit more conversation, I think, around.
Yeah. Rebecca answered Ren's question saying, I wish I had known how patient we have to be for change to occur in museums. We hear you, Rebecca. It's about this and so many other issues. There are times when something so simple, sharing pronouns, for example, can take a lot of debate before a commitment is made institutionally. It can be even tougher without buy-in from leadership, of course. Then Sophia has two questions. Thank you, Sophia. How do you think art institutions can provide that support, safety to queer artists against public backlash and hate crimes? That's one. And the second, that new law that allows denouncing queer people anonymously, I believe brings another interesting debate about what a queer person even looks like for it to be possible to visually identify them. Thank you, Sophia. So the second was not a question. It's a very good point. Thank you. Would you like to answer the first question? How do you think art institutions can provide support and safety to queer artists and queer members of staff in general, perhaps? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Ben, would you like to take this question?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think the best we can do is to try to provide safety within our institutions, right? That's where we're going to have the most ability and the most influence to create cultures that have the comfort and ease with artists whose identities are queer in some way, shape, or form. And that's a big task, depending on the size of the organization and the complexity of the organization, because I think, you know, museums are such stratified places, and there are some museums that are doing better now around making all the members of the museum who work at the museum, all the people that work at the museum, sort of feel recognized and appreciated, that are working on sort of the issues of economic equity that plague our field, that are like looking at the classism and sort of the implicit bias around sort of position and role. So, you know, it's the rare institution where the person who's thinking about safety and security in the galleries, or the person who is selling you a ticket at the front desk, and the person who's leading a classroom, or a curator or an administrator, all really feel like they are equal partners in making this thing happen. So what we need to do is, first, the best way we can make people feel safe is make institutions safe for the people who are working within them and coming into them every day. It's not a quick fix. And then we can welcome people in that same spirit. We cannot protect people from, you know, societal homophobia, and what we can do is do everything that we know how to make sure that all of the experiences in our institutions are reflecting the realities, lives, issues, concerns of the people in our cultures who are being targeted, whether those are queer people or Black and brown people or members of religious minorities or whatever that might be. That's the only, you know, I mean, we've entered a field where the change is slow internally, but also the change that we are trying to affect in the world is not quick. We're not direct service organizations. We're not activist. I mean, we can be activist museums, but we are not sort of organizations that are engaged with sort of direct change sort of at the legal or political level. We're about changing hearts and minds. We're about modeling what a truly inclusive, respectful, accepting space could feel like in a culture where that's not the norm. That's really the only way that I know how to try to affect change.
That sounds very political to me. There's one more question for you, Ben, from Sandra. Sorry. Is it important for the LGBTQ plus museum to hire queer people to work there in all areas? Is it an objective of your museum to let queer people be involved in telling their own story, from executive directors to janitors? I'm sorry, I don't know that word. You'll explain it to me. Or are there any other qualities that you look for when hiring people, apart from being qualified, of course?
Yeah. You know, our commitment, and a janitor is someone whose job it is to keep the place looking beautiful and clean and safe. So our commitment is to centering storytelling in the places where that lived experience and that expertise sort of most directly resides. So, you know, again, we really take our role is to create a platform where we bring people to tell stories. So when you're telling LGBTQ plus histories, you're going to need queer people to tell those stories, not exclusively, because again, we're living intersectionally, we're living in contexts, you know, where many of us come from families with parents who don't identify within our space. So, you know, we talk about a space that is brought to life where we're telling stories that haven't been told before, from the indigenous beginnings of our country to the present day, and where we engage queer creatives, artists, storytellers, and experts, curators, knowledge holders in the work. But by no means does that mean that 100% of the team is going to identify as part of our community. There are, you know, I think for us, it's really about, you know, understanding that, you know, we're thinking as much about other aspects of identity, other facets of identity that are underrepresented within LGBTQ organizations. And so in the States, that means people of color, Black and brown people, people who are gender nonconforming or genderqueer or transgender. You know, we have a lot of intentionality about, you know, representation mattering, not sort of at a superficial level, but understanding that we're going to make better decisions and create better products if the people involved, you know, come from the experiences that we're trying to present. So yeah, I guess, you know, it's not that clear, but when you're trying to root storytelling in authenticity and you're a queer organization, a lot of folks are going to be queer.
Yeah, I was thinking that a family close to me, the grandfather transitioned recently, and she's 65. The children seem to be, you know, it was for them maybe a bit more natural to consider the, you know, a situation that is new to them. It was a bit more difficult perhaps for the rest of the family. It's not easy. It changes everything. How can we help the rest, the families, when they go through this experience? At the same time, I was thinking, what a prison it must have been, a life up to 65 where you cannot be who you are. Yeah. Do you think there is an issue here? I think it was the first time I got so close to a story and I realized what it means for all members of the family, not just for one member of the family.
Well, I think that's actually the same age of the grandparent that we focused on in Mimi's family. So that exhibit was designed for children at Boston Children's Museum. And the story is a local Boston area family, 3 generations, a grandmother, her children, and the grandchildren. And the grandchildren were all about the same age of the children who were visiting the museum. So they immediately had that connection to them. And it was, you know, really helpful, I think, for visitors, if they didn't have anyone trans in their lives, to like understand it from the children's point of view, because the children, we used like excerpts from interviews that I conducted with the kids to help tell that story. And they're great at explaining it. At one point, you know, one of the granddaughters explains, well, oh, they got to name her, which was like, that was something that was important to her. She wanted them to like come up with her grandmother name.
Mhm.
So that's where Mimi is. It's her name's Erica, but her grandchildren call her Mimi. And they got to pick that out. And I think that, yeah, I think like one of the granddaughters said something like, she used to wear ties and now she wears dresses. And like, that was just like, it was just like a really easy like explanation that was sort of like, because I think I was asking her, you know, like, what's different? And like, that's all she could really think of, because it was like, she's still the same person. And we asked, you know, one of the, and so that little girl, I think she was about 8 or 9 when I interviewed her. And her little, like one of her little cousins, I think he was about 4. The way he understood it was like, Mimi changed to be happy. And
that's so nice.
It was just something really nice that like you imagine like all of these kids are growing up with the sense that like you can change and your happiness is important. And like, I just think that's really a nice message for all the kids who came to that exhibit.
Yep. There's a question from Isabel. What books or articles would you suggest for someone willing to explore these issues further? Maybe you can send us a small list later by email and we can share it with everyone. But if 1 or 2 titles come up right away, please share them. Ben shared something in the
I
chat
popped
already.
a link to Margaret's writing. Craig Middleton, and I'm just trying to remember. Margaret, do you remember? Yeah. Co-authored a book called Creating the Museum that's really excellent. Those are, you know, I feel like it's all the Middletons in the world who
all the Middletons
doing this good work.
No relation.
Great. Margaret, anything else that comes to mind?
Yeah, Sue Ferrentinos's book, Interpreting LGBTQ History in Museums and Historic Sites, is great, very practical, which I always appreciate. As somebody from the exhibit side of things, I tend to really appreciate a case study.
Yeah.
I like those concrete examples.
Great. Pedro has shared with us a bit more of information about the Hungarian law. And because we have about 7 minutes left, now it's the time to ask your questions. If there is anything else or any comments for those people who are more reserved or more shy, please. No? Okay, then I think we can leave it to this. Thank you so much again, Margaret and Ben, for accepting our invitation. It was a beautiful discussion. We'll go away with lots of things to think about and some references here to read more, to get to know more. There is one more comment. Let me see if it's a question. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you too. Thank you, everyone who's been with us. If you want to turn on your cameras now so that Ben and Margaret can feel a bit more, you know, accompanied. It was great that you found the time to be with us today. As usual, as soon as we have the video edited, we'll share it on our website and you can share it with more friends and colleagues. So thank you all so much for this, and until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.